a friend comes to me. I'm waiting tables at the time at a restaurant. We moved back to Riverside, California, was the town where Tina and I had been raised in. And I started waiting tables. And this young man who's a waiter there invites me on a spiritual retreat. He says, "Hey, how would you like to go out to this monastery? It's called St. Andrew's Abbey. It's a Benedictine monastery." and I, and he said it's really a nice place, and let's go there. And so I agreed. And so one weekend we drove out there, and I spent like 3 days at this Benedictine monastery, and I loved it. So this is really going to announce to your viewers how dumb I am, okay? Because I never once thought to myself, this is Catholic, these guys are heretics. What am I doing here? That kind of thing. I didn't think that. If you had asked me, what do you think of Catholic theology? I would have said, oh, Catholics are nuts. They're just out there, and they're not biblical and all that. I would have said that, but I loved the environment, and I loved being there. I love the ambiance. I love the whole thing. I love the bells ringing and going into the chapel like 6 times a day, and kneeling there and praying with the monks and hearing them chant the Psalms and all of that.
I think of visiting missions in California as a kid. That's what you're describing is how I felt at those missions. There was something very special there.
Yeah, yeah. Even though it's Catholic, right? The
Yeah.
missions were Catholic. Yeah. So that's what happened to me, Eddie. I'm basically driving home from this spiritual retreat, just thinking, God, what a great place. And I'm not asking myself any questions like, theologically, like, what are you doing? Why are you wanting to go to a Benedictine monastery? Those guys are the heretics. And it was nothing like that. And I actually continued to go there. I'd say about once a year. From that time on, I started going to the Benedictine monastery, and never once thinking, do the Catholics actually have something to say? I mean, is there anything they have to say? I had read a few of the standard books against Catholicism, like Hislop's book, The Two Babylons,
Okay.
the horror of Babylon and all that,
yeah.
and the famous book by Lorraine Bettner, Catholicism. So I had read the books that tell you how apostate Catholicism is. And since I loved the Puritans, and the Puritans hated Catholicism,
Yeah.
I never imbibed their hatred though for the Catholic Church, but I did agree with them theologically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so anyway, I was in my doctoral program, and then I got invited to become an associate pastor at a church, a youth pastor over junior high school and college. And so I kind of dropped my doctoral studies. And a warning for all you students out there: if you really want to finish your doctorate, don't think you're going to take like a little break from it, because I dropped it and I never got back to it.
Wow.
So anyway, take that from this broadcast, if nothing else. So I dropped the doctorate because I thought I want to get involved in hands-on ministry, and I became a youth pastor. And so I was a youth pastor for 3.5 years at a Baptist church in Riverside. And then I was invited to become the senior pastor of another church closer to Los Angeles. And I went there, and I was a pastor there for 8 years.
Oh, cool.
So all in all, I was a pastor, and I was ordained the last 8. I was a pastor for about 11 years. Okay. And so I had this background that I've mentioned to you about faith and works. And I was still going to the monastery once in a while, but never giving a thought to Catholicism. Okay. I was a Baptist, fairly Calvinist Baptist, and that's what I was. Okay, now here's where the bomb falls in my life, and it really fell out of a clear blue sky. I'm in church one Sunday night, and a gentleman asked me if we can talk, and said sure. So we went to a room, and we were standing there, actually, just standing down in the youth room downstairs, and he says to me, Pastor Ken, he said, I've been debating with these people down in San Diego, this group called Catholic Answers. And he had become very anti-Catholic for his own personal reasons. And he's just a layman, but he had just launched out, writing to Catholic Answers and telling them that they were heretics. And Patrick Madrid was the apologist there at the time, and who was writing him back. Anyway, I knew nothing of Catholic Answers or Patrick Madrid or anything like that. And he says, they've sent me some stuff. He goes, a lot of it's over my head. I wonder if you would take a look at it and help me, show me where the Catholics are wrong, basically. And then he said, and they sent me a set of tapes by some guy named Scott Hahn. And he said, the tapes are called Answering Common Objections Against the Catholic Faith. And at that point, you go by Eddie, right?
I do. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. I was calling you Eddie, and I realized maybe he doesn't like Eddie.
No, that's perfect.
Maybe reminds you of Eddie Haskell, from the Leave It to Beaver show. Never mind.
Yeah, I got that a lot as a kid.
So. You did?
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, here's why my jaw hit the floor at that point. And I got to turn the scroll back. When I was in seminary, okay, this is 1993 now, which is still a long, long time ago, but 1993 when this gentleman presented this to me. And he said, I've got this set of tapes, Answering Common Objections Against the Catholic Faith by some guy named Scott Hahn. Okay, that's 1993. Well, in 1981, so 12 years before, I met Scott Hahn. He came to Fuller Seminary because he was contemplating doing doctoral work, possibility of doing doctoral work at Fuller. And he was contemplating doing doctoral work maybe with the very professor that I was talking about a moment ago, whose teaching assistant I had become. So I remember sitting in a course on the Greek exegesis of 1 John, and I'm sitting there, and I remember distinctly, I was looking down at my binder, and all of a sudden I heard somebody ask a really smart question. And it was a voice I didn't recognize. And I still remember it to this day. I look over, and I see this skinny little guy sitting over there asking a really smart question. Well, when the lecture ended, my professor invited me up to the podium, and he invited Scott up to the podium. And he said, Ken, this is Scott Hahn. He's in town for a couple of weeks. He's considering maybe doing doctoral work here. I wonder if you would play his host and take him around, as he gets to know professors in the school and whatnot. And so what happened was I became his host, and he was in town for, I'm thinking 2 weeks, but I'm not sure. But he and I were both maniacally studying biblical theology, and we were both reading a lot of the same books. And that's why he was kind of attracted to this professor that I was working for and all that. So Scott and I ended up spending a lot of time over the course of a week or two, driving around in my car and just talking 100 miles an hour about all the things we were learning, biblical studies and all that. So I knew Scott. Scott went back to the East Coast, and in the end, he didn't come to California. But he and I stayed in touch for maybe 2 years, actually, on the phone, maybe writing a couple of letters and all that. And then the friendship just sort of faded away. So now a decade goes by, basically. And all of a sudden this guy says, I got these tapes by Scott Hahn called Answering Common Objections. And my jaw hit the floor because I thought, there's no way on earth this is the same guy. It can't be. There's no way.
Crazy.
Yeah. And so I remember saying to him, it's kind of sad because he had come to me with his problem. He wanted me to help him, explain why Catholicism's wrong. But as soon as he said Scott Hahn, it's like all I could think about was my problem. And I remember saying to him, where are those tapes? And he said, oh, don't worry, they're at home. I'll bring them next week. And I said, no. I said, I'm following you to your house now. And got in my car, followed him home. He gave me the tapes. I still remember walking outside and just looking at that package and flipping it over and seeing Scott's face on the back. And it's like, oh my word, how there's no way that Scott Hahn would be a Catholic, because he was a very, very staunch Presbyterian, Calvinist. There's no way. And I'm looking at this package. So I get in my car, Eddie, and I'm thinking, I want to put in tape number 1, which is his conversion story. Protestant minister becomes Catholic. But the tape player in my car is busted. I mean, these are little cassette tapes, okay?
Okay.
You remember those?
I do.
Yeah.
Remember that.
And so my tape player is busted. So I put my foot flat to the floor, and I just drove as fast as I could all the way home. And I went into my house, and so that Tina wouldn't know what I was listening to, I put headphones on, and I sat and I listened to his conversion story. And this is in 1993. And I'm sure you've heard his conversion story.
I have that original tape.
Yeah, the original.
I don't even know how I came across it, but it was online. Someone put it online.
Yeah,
but
the original one that was recorded. So I listened to his story, and while I'm listening to him, Scott is talking in that story about how he came to understand the justification by faith alone, the classic teaching of Luther and Melanchthon and Calvin and them that came down from the Reformation, how he had come to realize it was wrong, and that faith and obedience leading to blessing is the pattern of the Bible. And I'm having this flashback to, oh my word, I've been thinking this way since I was in seminary.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize that this was a Catholic way of thinking. It's not only a Catholic way of thinking,
Sure.
but it's a Catholic way of thinking. And then he's talking about, other things, and I'm going back and thinking about the Benedictine monastery and the beauty of the liturgy there and the beauty of the chanting of the Psalms and how much I had loved being there. And all these things are coming into my head, all right? And then he asked the question, or he talks about how a student asked him the question one day, the fateful question, Dr. Hahn, or I guess Scott, because he wasn't a doctor yet, where does the Bible actually teach that the Bible alone should function as our guide? And how Scott says that it caught him off guard because he thought, well, it's obvious where the Bible teaches that. And then the more he thought about it, he's like, where exactly does it teach it?
Yeah.
The recognition that this was a presupposition, this was an assumption of his worldview. And when someone actually challenged it, well, where does it teach it? He found himself scrambling. And I'm hearing that, and I'm listening to Scott, and I'm thinking about the fact that I had been struggling as a pastor for a while with the fact that it was sort of my job to figure out my own theology. It seemed weird to me that I would go into my office every week and I would study the next passage in whatever book I was preaching through. And I would pull down this Presbyterian scholar and this Lutheran one and this Anglican one and this Scott, and I would just sort of synthesize all these things. And then I would get up in the pulpit and I would tell everyone the truth. And everyone in my church would basically accept what I said because I studied more than they did,
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's kind of like realization, is there really no one above me? Is this the way it works? That I just figure it out and I teach. And all of a sudden Scott's talking about how sola scriptura, the idea that scripture does function as the sole infallible rule of faith and practice, and that there's no other binding authority on earth above you, your job. And so I'm listening to this, and what I'm thinking, by the time I finished the tape, what I was thinking was I was sort of divided in half. Half of me was thinking, I think I can answer all this stuff. I think I have answers to everything Scott's raising here. And the other half of me was thinking, how come I don't know the case for the Catholic faith? How can I have gone a bachelor's degree in Bible and theology, a master's degree in theology? I'm even in a doctoral program. And I think of myself as a real scholarly kind of student. I'm
Sure.
reading high level all the time. How come I don't know the case for the Catholic faith? And so listening to Scott made me curious. That was the main thing, just curious. Well, I finished listening. I take off my headphones, and my wife says, "So what's Scott talking about?" And remember, I'm a Baptist pastor, and that's all I've been trained to do,
Yeah.
unless I want to go back into the bar and start playing guitar again. That's all I've been trained to do. And I'm almost 40 years old now. And this is how I earn my living. And we have a mortgage, and we have kids. And she says, "So what's Scott saying?" And I said, "Scott Hahn has become Catholic." And I remember Tina just said, "You're not going to become Catholic, are you?" Just straight.
Yeah.
And I don't know what I said, but it was sort of like, no, don't worry about that. No, I'm just listening.
You're just listening to some tapes.
Yeah, you got it. I'm just listening to a tape. Come on, why you get so serious? So, but I'm pretty sure though that I headed out of the room quickly, just went to bed. And the next morning, it was pedal to the metal again, all the way back to church. I went into my Baptist church. I went into my Baptist pastor office, and I bolted the door behind me, and I hunted Scott down. It said where he worked, on the back of the tapes, and I hunted him down. He was professor, I think, in Joliet at the time, Illinois. Anyway, I got Scott on the phone, and it was our reunion. Scott, this is Ken. And he said, "Ken, how you been?" And I was like, "How have you been?" I mean, wow, I heard your tape last night. You become Catholic. And the long and short of that was he basically was saying, "Ken, there's so much, I wouldn't even know where to begin. But if I got you some more tapes, would you listen to them?" And I said, "Yeah." So we get off the phone, he calls St. Joseph Communications, that had produced all of his stuff at that point, at least. And he says to them something along the lines of, I've got a Baptist pastor. I've got him hooked up on the line, send him everything. And so, Eddie, a couple of days later, I show up at my church and there's a big giant box sitting outside the door of my church. It's a good thing I was the first one there in the morning.
Oh, kidding.
Because this box was stamped all over the outside, St. Joseph Communications, just stamped everywhere. And I grabbed the box, and it was almost like someone had given me like drugs, like cocaine or pornography or something like that. I remember I grabbed that box and I just I snuggled it in. I mean, I smuggled it into my office and bolted the door again. And I opened it up, and Scott just basically had them send me free of charge, everything he had done to that point. So there's a whole series on Romans, a series on John, a series on Matthew, just, series on the sacraments, all this kind of stuff. And so then I had to figure out how to get rid of the cardboard, without anybody at church seeing, and how to smuggle these tapes out of my car and get them in the trunk right away. And I mean, at this point though, it was pure curiosity. It was curiosity, but I have to think that there was some seed planted in there, because I tell you, I've talked to, you probably have done this too. I've talked to so many evangelicals and Protestants, who are not curious at all, even ones that have known me. I mean, even ones that know the amount of study that I've done, they're just not interested. There's no spark of curiosity in them. And so I have to look back and think, well, I'm grateful. I have to think, Lord, thank you for making me curious, because I was curious. And I began to listen. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I can imagine that if someone was raised reading those anti-Catholic books that you mentioned, or any other book that potentially misrepresents the church, as you get older, I would assume that a lot of people would just rely on what they learned early on. Why would they even consider it if they are convinced of the true position? You know what I mean? Even though it's a misrepresentation, to them, that is the true position of the church. And if they hear Roman system over and over and over again, there'd be no reason to consider it, because, whoa, I got to stay away from that.
Well, you know what? Your question opens the door, because I think that you're right. And I think that it's to the degree that a Protestant is firm in his or her position, to that degree, then they will respond like you said. They'll just say, oh, that's nuts. I don't want to hear it, And so the truth is, I wasn't firm, and I don't think that I wasn't firm because, my mind is just like all confused or something. I think I wasn't firm because I was a serious student of biblical theology, and I had studied deeply enough to know that there were good arguments on multiple sides of things, that there were good arguments for the Lutherans and good arguments for Presbyterian, I realized that there were really good arguments, and I realized that there were brilliant scholars in each of these denominations who could put forth their arguments. And it wasn't easy just to say, well, you need to study harder. You need to study like me, or you need to pray and have the Holy Spirit lead you. Because I knew that there were great scholars who were studying hard and praying for the Holy Spirit to lead them in all of these denominations. And so that's what was making me uncertain. And so I think you're right, though, that if someone is not firm and totally certain in their theology, then they're probably going to be more open to things. And I was more open. Yeah. And it's true that the people that I've spoken to since then, the ones who are just really, really firm and happy with their theology, are the ones who don't care, who don't want to listen.
Don't want to hear it. Yeah.
Yeah. Because they're just like, I know what I know, and I'm fine, that kind of thing.
Well, another thing about Sola Scriptura, this is nothing profound. I'd like to share it. With Sola Scriptura, you're saying yes to that. And by saying yes to that, you're saying no to tradition. But when you look within interpretation, within Scripture alone, you start to see traditions of interpretation, because like you were saying, you're going to grab some tradition from this scholar, from this scholar, and from this scholar, from multiple denominations. And then that's going to help you come to a conclusion. But those are varied interpretive traditions that seem to just get, I don't know, they seem to get brushed aside. I've heard people say, well, that's not the tradition we're talking about. And then I'd say, if there are variants in any way, then what is sola scriptura? You know?
Yeah, you are, you're right. I mean, I could use the word worldview, that someone who's raised in a Presbyterian context and is reading mainly Presbyterian theologians is going to develop a Presbyterian worldview
Yes.
through which you could say tradition, through which they view scripture,
Yeah.
and through which the arguments all fall in one direction for them, because they're viewing the texts and the arguments through that grid, through that grid of their tradition. So you're right, pulling down these books was like pulling down different traditions.
Yeah.
And maybe that was my problem, is I was pulling down too many different ones, and so,
Yeah.
but that's exactly right. There is no completely objective scripture alone, approach to anything. And the people that I know that do that the most are the worst theologians. I mean, the ones I do run into people once in a while that say, "Oh, I don't want to read anything. All I need is God's word," and they don't recognize that they're just creating their own theology from
Their own
scratch.
theology. That's exactly what I said. You end up with your own statement of faith because you're saying and I've heard that, you've probably heard this so many times. Once there are so many options denominationally, people say, I'm done. I believe in Christ and that's enough for me. But then they'll go to the Bible and form their own statement of faith, thus becoming the equivalent of their own denomination. You can say all day that you are not about denominations, but what are you proclaiming? I proclaim Christ. What about Christ do you proclaim? And where did you get such an understanding of that? So
yeah, exactly. In fact, Martin Luther even said that Martin Luther said everyone's a theologian. It's just a matter of whether you're a good theologian or a bad theologian. So yeah, no one can escape the fact that even if they're just reading the Bible, they're developing views, and as you say, they're developing their own theology.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow, there's a lot there. Okay, well, so basically what happened is that Scott and I began to talk, and we began to have a series of conversations, maybe even a series of lighthearted debates with each other a little bit. But pretty soon I began to recognize that I had a lot that I wanted to learn. I had a lot to learn. Like I said, how do I not know the case? So Scott was a busy guy. I was a busy guy. So I remember I said to Scott at a certain point, hey, look, send me a list of maybe 20 books that you think would be important for someone like me to read, and I'll just go on my own. And what happened to me was that began about a 4-year process of just becoming consumed with that question: are the claims of the Catholic Church true? And so I became that guy. I was a pastor. I was preaching. I was doing all the work that I was supposed to be doing. And on the side, I was just gobbling up, listening to every tape debate I could find, reading books one after another and all that, and trying to understand. And it wasn't a straight road. I would find myself really attracted to what was starting to form in my mind, the Catholic view of the church, the Catholic answer to sola scriptura, the Catholic view of salvation. But because I didn't want to become Catholic, because of all the ramifications it would have in my life, it was like every time I would read an argument from the Protestant side that seemed to even come close to answering the Catholic claims, I would just sort of grab it. And I would say, okay, now I don't need to study anymore. This answers it. And I'm a Baptist and I'm fine. And I would proceed along that path for a month or two, but then almost like a big giant magnet, drawing me, I would suddenly find myself opening another book, listening to another lecture, and being drawn toward the church. And my wife, it was really hard in the family at that point, because when I started coming home with all these books under my arm, with great titles like Evangelical is Not Enough by Thomas Howard, and the Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma by Ludwig Ott and stuff like that,
Yeah.
She knew that I was serious, and when she began to recognize that I was serious, she began to crack in some ways, because she had no interest in Catholicism, none. And she's very practically minded.
Yeah.
And so she was looking at me, and she was seeing the outcome. She was thinking, if you become Catholic, you're going to lose your ministry. You're going to have to start all over. You're going to have to recreate yourself in a totally different occupation. We have a house, we have a mortgage, we have kids, and also we have a wonderful church. We have a church that loves us. We love them. Some of our best friends in the world are in this congregation that I'm pastoring now. Um, Tina had some of the best friends she'd ever had there. And she's just thinking, we're going to lose all this. So for the first year or maybe even 2 years, we could not even talk about what I was studying and learning. Just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
She was, she would be upset and angry, and I would become upset. We'd be fighting about it. And um, so it wasn't good, but it wasn't as bad as many others. I work now, I'll come to this maybe later, but, I work for the Coming Home Network now. And so my job is helping Protestant pastors all over the world that are looking at the Catholic faith. And at some stage along the path that I
Oh,
walked.
so you're able to speak their language and just help them
Oh,
with their.
yeah. And some of them are in way worse position than I was in. I mean, some of them are in situations where their wives have just said flat out, "I will divorce you if you become Catholic," and worse. Well, well, no, not worse. None of them have said, "I'll kill you," if you become Catholic. But some of them are older, and they've been in the ministry longer, and their wives are completely opposed, and they just don't even know what to do. But anyway, for the first year or two, we really couldn't talk about it. It was really tough. And Tina would say to me, "Why are you reading those books? Why? I mean, you have a church that loves you. Our life here is really good. Why don't you just throw that stuff in the trash can? The tapes and the books and all that." And maybe I could have at the beginning. Maybe if the second I heard about Scott, if I just thrown it all in the trash and just, closed my ears and.
Sorry, I have to interject here. That's,
Yeah,
I brought this up in another video.
that's all right.
I made a video about it,
Uh-huh.
Vincible Ignorance, where you're saying, okay, stop talking. There's something in my heart that's saying this could be right, but it can't be. So I'm going to shut it down. It's kind of what you're talking about. And then
Yeah.
there's that curiosity or that draw that you can respond to. So
Yeah, I guess I had learned too much by that point, and I'd seen too much of the possibility that it could be true, that it wasn't possible for me to just throw it in the trash can anymore. And so we lived that way for a long time. And like I said, I went back and forth since I knew that Tina was really unhappy with it and all that too. Like I said, anytime I would read a good Protestant argument, I would feel like, okay, we're fine now. And I would make the mistake of telling her, "Oh, don't worry, I read this argument and I'm pretty sure the Catholics are wrong now." And then she would be, "Oh, great, great, great." So now we go back to our normal life. And then about a month later, she catches me in the corner, reading another book and, you know, um, with a Catholic title, another conversion story or whatever. So anyway, this goes on for a few years. And about, thankfully, about 2 years into the process, I think I could see that Tina began to absorb almost by osmosis, I think, some of the things I was learning and some of the things that she would hear me saying. And she began to soften a little bit. And about 3 years down the road of study, she said to me one day, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "I think I have to resign. I don't think I can go on." And she said, "But are you totally sure? Are you certain?" Which I'm looking at you and I'm wondering, do you remember that process of trying to get to certainty on this thing? Because I remember saying, I was thinking, well, you mean like mathematically certain? You mean like proof, like a logical proof, like a syllogism? And I was like, no, I can't prove it, but I think. And she just said, "Please, will you give it one more year? Will you pray? Will you study? Will you keep reading? Give it one more year and we will talk together and I will be willing to learn. And then if you are sure a year from now," then she says, "we can leave, the ministry."
yeah.
And I said, "Okay." And she went out of the room, and I'm no kidding, no exaggeration. She came back into the room with a contract. She had written up a contract and she put it in front of me, a simple little contract.
Yeah.
She put it in front of me and said, sign on the line, which is dotted." And that's what happened. And
What year was that?
well, this is about 3 years into the process, so probably around 1990, maybe the beginning of 1996 or the end of 1995,
Okay.
something like that. So anyway, though, Tina did begin to listen and to learn. And around that time, I did something accidentally genius. Okay. I didn't plan it. I didn't plot it, but it turned out to be genius. What it is I was collecting all these quotations from the early church fathers at this point, because I had read John Henry Newman and stuff, and, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. So anyway, on a biblical level, I was beginning to absorb I was beginning to absorb the Catholic case, and I was beginning to understand that sola scriptura wasn't scriptural. It wasn't the faith of the church ever. It was unworkable from the time of the Reformation. It had served as a blueprint for anarchy and, a million theological views and denominations and all that, that it wasn't even logical because it couldn't account for the canon. I don't want to go on to each of these, but biblically, I was becoming convinced. And then history was a big one, because John Henry Newman had said, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. I'd begun reading the early church fathers carefully and sympathetically, and realizing these people sound so Catholic in so many ways, So what I was collecting all these quotations from the early fathers that would support Catholic doctrines. And I gave them to Tina and asked her if she'd type them up for me, because back then they weren't on the internet. I had to mark them in books.
Yeah.
And I wanted her to type them up as a document for me, like all these great quotations. You probably have Jimmy Akin's book on The Fathers Know Best.
I don't. I've heard it referenced so many times. I've heard people draw from it a number of times, but I don't have it.
Well, that's what he did, is on each of these subjects, he gives a little introduction, and then he just gives quotation after quotation from the early church fathers in support of various Catholic doctrines. It's a great resource. So I'm giving her all these things to type up. And so she's sitting at her computer, with a Word document, and she's starting to type the words of St. Ignatius of Antioch and Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and all these people, and she's being affected by it. I had all these passages on baptism, baptismal regeneration, and on the Eucharist, on these different things. And anyway, one night we're in church, and this again is on a Sunday night. And after the Sunday evening service, some kind of conversation broke out about baptism. And I don't remember what it was or the subject, but about 20 people were there, and my associate pastor was there too, and we were talking about baptism. And all of a sudden, Tina says, well, Polycarp said, she starts rattling off. Polycarp, come on, in a Baptist church.
Yeah, who's it? They're like, what the heck are you talking about?
Yeah, she said, well, Polycarp said blah, blah, blah. She starts quoting it. And I remember my associate pastor kind of laughed, and he said, oh, Polycarp can go fish, playing on the word carp. And, but I almost feel like, I don't almost feel, I feel like that was a little bit of a turning point. Like when I looked over at Tina, she had this look in her eyes, like, this guy doesn't care what Polycarp said. I mean, Polycarp was a disciple of John. And he was taught by John. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he doesn't care what Polycarp had to say. And I felt like that she was like making the turn, like I could see in her face that she was making the turn. And so anyway, this went on, and the time came near where I just knew that I had to leave. I was just torn in half going into the pulpit every week. I was preaching things every week that I believed were true, but more and more feeling like I don't belong here. I'm not a Baptist. I'm not a Baptist pastor anymore. I got to get out of here. And we had a new members class coming on schedule, to where I was going to be standing in a room and convincing, some people why Baptist theology is true and why they should join our Baptist church.
Some potentially some former Catholics, I'm assuming, right?
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
And so I just realized I had to do it. And so I planned to tell the church, not the congregation first, but the deacon board, which was sort of in a Baptist church. I was the pastor, my associate pastor, we kind of ran the church, but then there's a governing board of deacons.
Okay.
So I scheduled a deacon board meeting, and we went into the meeting, and I sat there, and I was just like trembling. Then I was scared to death to do this. In fact, people often say it's a common response to hear people say how courageous you were, to leave your ministry to become Catholic. And whenever I hear that, I mean, I don't relate. And here's why: because I wasn't courageous. I was scared to death. But I felt like a guy in a burning building. Your house is on fire. You're in the building. You drop down on the floor and you crawl around, just try to stay beneath the smoke. But
Yeah.
at a certain point, you just have to run out the door, you know. And here's how I portray it. When you do run out the door, no one meets you in the front yard and says, how brave you are. You feel like saying, what are you talking about? My house was on fire.
Yeah.
I didn't want to run out. I was scared to run out. Everything in me wanted to stay in the place, but it was on fire. And so I had to run out. And so anyway, I remember standing there and saying, okay, listen, I have to tell you something. This is the deacon board. I'm not going to be able to remain here any longer. I've been in a very deep spiritual and theological struggle for a few years now, and I'm on my way into the Catholic Church. I just basically blurted it out like that. And it was like a bomb had gone off in the deacon board meeting. It was really bad. People were confused. This elderly gentleman that I loved very much just started to cry, had tears in his eyes. So anyway, that's what I did. And then we had a congregational meeting, and I told the congregation what was happening. And my wife's sitting there just trembling too,
Yeah.
but we were together at that point enough to where we were going to go to RCIA together, and we were going to make this journey together. But I told the congregation, and then I said to them, look, if you want me to stay here as your pastor until you can find someone, to replace me, then I'll do that. And the congregation wanted me to do that. So that's what I thought was going to happen. I thought, okay, well, I'll probably be here another 6 months, but at least they know the truth now.
Yeah.
And they know that I'm out the door. But that was completely naive thinking, because someone on the deacon board, told the denomination what was happening, which was correct thing to do. And I got a call from the denomination the very next day, and they said, that they wanted to meet with me that night. So the very next night, here I thought I was going to be there another 6 months. The very next night, I'm sitting in my office with a few people from the denomination, leadership people.
Sure.
And they basically said, so what is going on? And these are people I didn't even really know too much. And I said, well, I'm becoming Catholic. I told them.
Yeah.
And they basically just said to me, I don't remember all the words at all, but they basically said, you want 1 week to say goodbye or 2?
Wow.
So I was just out.
Now, do a lot of these people view it as you being deceived? I don't know if you want to go down this path just a little bit, but I'm fascinated. If someone is just trying their best to understand and seek the Lord, how do they view it? Do they view it as, boy, this man has just been deceived? What was the common response? Or is it just question after question? Okay, why don't you explain this doctrine? Why don't you explain it? Can you?
It's all of the above. It's just a huge array, all the way from people who perk up like I did when I heard Scott's story.
Yeah.
People who perk up and are curious and are thinking, why would Pastor Ken want to become Catholic? I'm curious. And they wanted to ask questions. And in the end, 2 families ended up becoming Catholic with us from that church. But it's that all the way to the other end, which one family was, you've been taken captive by the devil, and I never want to speak to you again. And then just a lot of people in the middle that you don't know what they think, because you never talk to them one by one. Maybe a lot of them just thought, well, that's strange, but I'm happy where I'm at. Everything.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, all of the above. And so, but it is true that there were a lot that wanted to argue with me. And so I left the ministry and I went home. And when I should have been looking for a new job, which I needed to do right away, I had like 7 or 8 guys, just this email group, just plastering me with questions, and wanting me to defend the Catholic faith. And I spent too much time in front of the computer doing that, just writing.
Yeah.
And slowly realizing that most of them had never read one book written by a Catholic in their entire life. That they were just operating out of all the stereotypes that they had, misconceptions they had, whatever they had learned, their view of Catholicism. And they were hitting me, and they were wanting me to essentially write in email form a complete complete apologetic work for the Catholic faith.
Sure.
And anything I did write, they would come back, yeah, but what about, and yeah, but what about, and so I began to realize pretty quickly that, you know what, this is endless and I can't be doing this. And so I think I wrote an email at one point that might have sounded kind of arrogant, but what I said was, I said, look, you guys, I've been studying this stuff for 4 years now. I've read a ton of books and listened to a ton of lectures. Here are some of the best titles, and I listed them. And I said, why don't you read these books and then ask me a question, something like that. Read these books and then get back to me. I can't sit here. Basically, I have to find a job. I can't sit here and recreate, the Summa, the Summa in email form, and defend this whole thing.
Yeah.
That it took me 4 years to absorb.
Wow.
So that's what I did. And you want to hear a little aftermath then?
Please.
Yeah, we have a few more minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I had not planned very well, because I guess I was just living in so much stress the last months, and knowing that I had to go and being afraid to go and what am I going to say and how's this going to work and all that. And I was scared to death of my father too, because my dad had later in life, well, he was about 46 years old. He had had a major conversion to Christ himself. And like I said, he'd been married 5 times. He was married his 5th time, by then. He had been an alcoholic though, and all this stuff. And he had this major conversion to Christ. And if he could have, he would have wanted to become a Baptist pastor. He was very, very sincere, evangelical, loved the Lord. And so when I became a Baptist pastor, his son, and, we had been separated because of divorce, broken home and all that. So I wasn't extremely close to him, but he used to come listen to me preach, and he would sit in the pew with tears running down his face, just so proud, like I was the apple of his eye. And now
Sure.
I'm becoming Catholic. And what am I going to say to him? And in fact, I remember when I was about 3/4 of the way along in my own conversion, going to his house one time to visit, and I walk into the living room, and Pope John Paul II's face is on the television screen. And my dad just goes, oh, he says, I can't stand to look at that man. Because he was a straight fundamentalist Baptist. The only thing he had ever known was that. And Catholicism was an abomination, to him. And so I had that in my mind too. Okay.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I left the ministry, and right around the time, I'll close off the dad story quickly. Right around the time that I decided that I had to resign, we found out that my dad had been diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease,
Oh,
and that he was really far along. So in a way, that saved me, because I talked with a priest and I said, what am I going to do if I tell my dad it's going to kill him? And he said, how bad is your dad? And I said, he's very weak. He can't walk very well anymore. He's very emotional. He cries at the drop of a hat and all that. And the priest actually encouraged me not to tell him. He said, does your dad love the Lord? And I said, yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, he was a fully sincere Christian who, from the time he was converted at 46 until the end of his life, had been completely devoted to walking with Christ in the way that he knew, as an evangelical, as a fundamentalist Baptist. And he said, don't even tell him. He said, there's no way that he will have the ability to comprehend that, this, to accept it, to think it through, anything like that. It'll probably just kill him sooner, So I actually did that. I didn't even tell him I had resigned. And when I went to visit him, the last while he was laying in a bed, in a hospital bed in his home. And so I read the Bible with him. We talked, about the Lord. And he asked me one time how things were going. And I said, well, Dad, I said, I'm not really in the ministry anymore. And I was sticking my neck out a bit. And he's, in the old days, he would have said, why, what's going on? He would have been sharp. And he just looked at me and said, oh, okay. And I said, I have reasons for thinking that I shouldn't be in the ministry right now, and so I'm out. And he just accepted it. Wow. So anyway, I was with my dad, and he ended up, he passed away without ever knowing. So, but I left, and Tina and I began to live on credit cards, and we began to go in debt, and it was really bad. So I went out, don't laugh, okay? I went out to get a job waiting tables to start, because I thought, I had waited tables in seminary. I actually enjoyed it. And I thought, hey, I got white hair, maybe I could be a maitre d', like in a high class restaurant. I had these stupid dreams. I was 42 at the time, and maybe I could make some money while I figure out what to do. And so I got a job waiting tables, and that didn't work very well because they put me on lunch shift. The tips were horrible. I found out it was going to take me. It was a very fine restaurant, but because of that, everybody wants to wait tables at it, and I found out it was going to take me like a year to get enough seniority to be on dinner shift. And anyway, I had some weird experiences. I got to tell you one of them. I was in the kitchen one day. This is like about 3 months after I resigned the ministry, and I was sitting there folding napkins. I was in the kitchen before the lunch shift, folding napkins, and I was thinking about Martin Luther, and I was thinking about some aspect of the Reformation or whatever. And all of a sudden, I heard someone yelling at me. I heard someone just like at the top of their lungs, like yelling, almost screaming, really. And I looked over, and my manager was standing there at the door, and she was screaming at me to fold the napkins faster, that I was folding the napkins too slowly. And I had this kind of like wake up moment where I was just standing there thinking, I was a senior pastor. I was in a church. I was safe. I had an occupation in which I was safe the rest of my life. I used to get on airplanes and fly to pastors' conferences, and now I'm folding napkins. And this woman who's like about a dozen years younger than me is shrieking at me.
Yeah.
Is shrieking at me because I'm not folding them fast enough. And yet this is what I'm thinking. And yet what I did was I'm sorry, I apologized. And I started folding faster. And I'm like, wow. So it was a kind of a feeling of what in the world did you do?
Yeah.
And Christmas came, and I'd always been home with my family on Christmas Eve. And that year I was waiting, on dinner shift for Christmas Eve. They needed everybody. And so my wife and kids came down to the restaurant, and they sat in a booth in my section so we could be together on Christmas Eve.